As far as I can tell, between guest speakers and Pastor Alex and Pastor Lovelady speaking, this is my 30th message on the book of Genesis, and we are just closing up Genesis chapter 11. In early July, I received an email from our beloved Lyle Piment regarding the Genesis series. And at that point, we had been in Genesis for 5 months, and we were just closing Genesis 3. And I'd like to read to you his email. Hey, Pastor Ben, I just want to let you know how much I have enjoyed your preaching. He could have ended it right there. Last week, I noticed that we were finally starting chapter 4. Knowing that it was then June 25th, my nimble mind started calculating mathematical time equations. To decipher this conundrum, I used 26 weeks as a standard for 4 chapters. I like to round up, which gives us 6.5 weeks per chapter. With 50 chapters in Genesis, that gives us 46 remaining chapters to study, multiplied by 6.5 weeks per chapter, giving us 299 weeks, divided by 52 weeks a year, which equals 5.75 years. Just for fun, we will finish Genesis sometime around April 1st, 2023. April Fool's Day. Finn will be getting ready for his sophomore year in high school. If we continue studying completely through the entire Old Testament at the same blistering rate, when I retire sometime around 10 years from now, you and Becky will be celebrating your 25th wedding anniversary, and we will be studying Numbers chapter 12. By the time you celebrate your 50th wedding anniversary, we will be studying the 16th chapter of 2 Kings. We will finish the Old Testament sometime around February 2133. And we will finally finish the New Testament sometime around August 2165, and then we can start over again in Genesis. Lyle. Well, the reason I read that to you is just to let you know what a delight Lyle Piment is. And also to take a public opportunity to correct my cheerful critic. That's a joke. But I am going to give a defense here. So Genesis is divided into 2 parts. Genesis 1 through 11, and that could be held with a banner above it that says God and the whole world. Okay, so Genesis 1 through 11 covers God and the whole world. And then Genesis 12 through 50 covers, it could have a banner over it that says God and Abraham's family. Okay, so that's the idea of Genesis. That's how it's written. And you could pretty much put the rest of the Bible in that second part, from Genesis 12 on through Revelation. And so I say that to say that Lyle's email could have read, Pastor Ben, we're a mere 30 weeks into Genesis, and you've already preached half the Bible. But we are at a halfway point, at least in the book of Genesis, coming to the end of Genesis chapter 11. And I want to take this sermon as an opportunity to touch on chapter 11, but also to summarize what the author has tried to accomplish in these first 11 chapters. That's what we want to get to this morning. Because it's easy, potentially, with 30 messages on Genesis 1 through 11, that you might miss the forest for sake of the trees. And I don't want that to happen this morning. So I want to sum up what Genesis 1 through 11 is all about and it take essentially 29 chapters and put them into one sermon and be done by noon. So here's the idea. What is Genesis 1 through 11 all about? I hope that you'll track with me to understand this because it's crucial to understanding the rest of Genesis and the rest of the Bible itself. How does God start? God starts by creating the world completely perfect in the first word. True? Not true. It's not true. God did not start by creating the world in perfect working order right from the beginning. He didn't do that. You need to look no further than Genesis 1. God didn't decide. He could have. In a divine fiat, he could have said, let there be the world and go. And it could have just, boom, came out just the way he wanted it. But he didn't do that. He started by creating a formless and void, watery mass. That's what he did. And you got to ask, why did God start with what appears to be chaos? Why would he start with that? Why wouldn't he just do it the way he wanted to? He has the power. Why wouldn't he just do it that way from the get-go? And the answer to that is that God is seeking to teach us something about his character so that we can live out that character. And what is he seeking to teach us? He's seeking to teach us with this watery mass that God loves to take what's unfinished, what's chaotic, what's disorderly, and make it beautiful. That's what he loves to do. And so he starts with this formless mass, and it says that the Spirit of God was hovering over the water. And this word for hover is a word that we'll catch in Deuteronomy, in 2,100 and whatever it is. We'll catch that word for hover, and it's used of an eagle hovering over its young in its nest. And it gets this idea that it's stirring up the nest, and it's teeming with life. And the eagle's about to take off and do wonderful things for its family. That's the picture you get in Deuteronomy 32. And so the Spirit of God is hovering over this watery mass, this chaos as it were, and it's about to do something awesome. And this is telling us something about God. God loves to do incredible things with stuff that's unformed, that's unfinished. And right away, the reader should feel that in his or her bones. That I am like creation as it first was. I'm unformed, I'm unfinished, but God can take this jar of clay and he can do miraculous things with it if I entrust myself to his care. So this is how the Bible starts. And then it goes from here, and it takes what he says, the earth was formless and void, and it spends the first three days taking care of the form problem. It was formless. So day one takes care of form, and it gives form to light and darkness. It separates them, gives form. Day two, it separates the water from the air. It gives form to the air and the water. Day three, it gives form to the land and the sea. It has the land rise up and separate it from the sea. So now, what was once formless now has form. But you still got the void problem. Formless and void. And so days 4 through 6 take care of the void problem. And he does it in a way that they correspond to each other. So day 4 corresponds to day 1. He separated light and darkness. Now he fills up light and darkness. He fills it up with the sun, the moon, and the stars and constellations. He fills up day 1. Then you go to day 5, and it fills up day 2. He gave form to water and air. Now he fills up water and air. He puts fish, and he teems the water with fish. And he puts birds in the air, and he teems the air with birds. So he fills up day 2. Then you go to day 3. You got the water and you got the land. You got the land coming up, but the land's empty. So what does he do? Well, he creates land animals. He fills up the land. And ultimately, he completes it with humanity. And so again, what you're catching here is that throughout this whole process, what is God saying throughout the whole thing? 7 times he'll say it. And God saw that it was good. So what you're getting is you're getting the identity of God, his character. God takes things unformed, uninhabited, and he forms it, and he makes it full. And if he can do that with earth, you got to know that in the ancient times, and really in our time, does anybody want to get caught in a boat out in the ocean in a storm? I mean, in ancient times, the sea was like this dangerous place, and it still is in our day, but we, feel a little bit more accomplished than they were. But it's still a scary thing. And here you see God directing the water and say, you come this far and you should come no further, Job says. So God takes all this powerful stuff that scares people to death, nature itself, and he handles it like it's a child. We see Jesus do the same thing in the sea. Be still, be calm. And the idea is that if God can do that, and his son can do that with this scary stuff, can't he do that with your scary stuff? Can't he do that with the thing that's on your mind this morning and you're fighting to keep it off? Can't he take care of your problem like he took care of the formless and void world to begin with? You see, because later in the prophet Jeremiah is going to say, speaking for God, that your land, Israel, is going to go back to being formless and void. There's going to be no people on it. It's going to go back to before people ever existed, and you're going to feel hopeless. But God can bring creation back with you just the way he did in Genesis 1. So God's very intentional on what he does, and he wants you to finish Genesis 1 by saying, man, God does good stuff. God gets good. He understands it. I've always been a person that I believe to have very great ideas, but just too late. It's in the story of my life. Great ideas. I'll get in a conversation with a person, we're disagreeing, and I wish I had the thought, but I have the thought at midnight what I should have said, and you may have the problem. But that's been my whole life, and as I was a youth pastor several years ago, Becky and I had this idea of we used to watch the show Amazing Race, and they would race all across the planet and do all these cool objectives and stuff and tricky things, and we said, we'll do that for the youth group in our area. And so we set up different obstacles at different people's houses across the neighborhood. And one of the obstacles I wanted to do was we had picked up this game in Galena where it had all these different shaped blocks. And the game came with a bunch of cards that showed a picture of a configuration that you had to create out of these blocks. But it was really hard to do, and it took some time. And I thought, this will be a great obstacle. I just had to build the blocks. I had to build all those shapes. Well, I've worked with wood before, and I was happy to do it, but I needed some help. And so I went over Glenn Cass's house, and I called Glenn that afternoon. The game was that night, mind you. And I said, Glenn, I got this great idea, and I want to do this, and this is what they need to look like. He's like, great, when do you need it done? And I said, by 6 o'clock. And if any of you know Glenn wanted nothing to do with this. He wanted nothing to do. And he said, no, there's no way we can do this right in that amount of time. And I said, Glenn, well, here's the thing. I'm not so concerned about right. I just want to get it done. And he said, fine. And so we worked together. And the whole time, Glenn was just discombobulated. He didn't have peace. The whole time he was just frustrated. But we did get it done. That was a Thursday night. Sunday morning, Glenn comes down to my office with a block. And he said, here is what I would have liked to do if we had the time. And it was this beautiful depiction of what I was wanting to do. And it was beveled on the edge. It was just perfect. And I kept that block. It's downstairs with all my junk that I got to figure out. But I kept that block to remind myself, do it right. Do it right. Don't rush things. And this was kind of a picture of the way God did things. God wants you to finish Genesis 1 and say, God does it right. God does it right. So if I want my marriage to look perfect, to be as enjoyable as it possibly could be, I'm going to come to God. And I'm going to see what he says about how to do marriage. If I want to get all I can out of my business or about my employment, if I want to do this, I'm going to go to God's word and I'm going to say, God, how do you say do this? How do you say do friendship? How do you say do finance? How do you say do work? I want to see what you say about it because I trust that your good is better than my good. That's the essence of Genesis 1. But God does something really cool. In Genesis 1, as he creates man, but he doesn't create woman yet. And you got to wonder, why didn't God just do woman at the same time? Why did he wait again with finishing and completing man, just like he didn't complete earth? He does the same thing with man. And I think the significance is this. Adam did not get to experience God's goodness firsthand. He didn't get to watch it happen, as it were. He didn't get to walk with God through it when God created the world. Adam didn't see the formless and watery mass. He didn't see that. But he did see himself. And God says, Adam, I got something to do. I got something for you to do. I want you to go and I want you to name all the animals. And so Adam goes. Eve's not created yet. And he goes to the ox, and he goes to the squirrel, and he goes to all these different animals, and he classifies them, he names them. But it says, for Adam, no fitting helper was found. So God wanted to escort Adam, and he says, Adam, I want you to do this. And as he's doing it, it's as though God's watching Adam, and he's saying, does he get it yet? Does he see it yet? Does he feel the angst yet? Does he feel the watery mass that he is yet, that he's incomplete just like creation was? Does he feel that yet? And eventually, Adam feels it. He feels this is not done. This is incomplete. They all have a fitting, corresponding match, and I don't. And so once Adam gets it, God says, go to sleep. Go to sleep. He goes to sleep. He wakes up, and the first husband, or the first father, as it were, walking down his bride, his daughter, to her mate, God brings Eve to Adam. Adam says, this at last. And so now you know Adam did get it, because he says in the Hebrew, this at last. In other words, it hasn't come yet. I've been waiting for it. Now there's bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She's like me, but she's different, just like the animals. And so Adam experiences firsthand, he experientially feels how good God does with stuff. He takes incompleteness and he makes it like a reunion. Adam's experienced a reunion with himself. She's bone of my bone, she's flesh of my flesh, and we'll come together again and we will become one. We'll be reunited. She's taken from me, we'll come back together. And so now, without a shadow of a doubt, Adam knows in his gut that God does good with stuff. And so with everything I have, Adam should experience and know that I can trust God with it. Because God will take whatever is incomplete and he'll make it perfect. Perfect. As he sees Eve, he knows that. And so God takes Adam, he takes Eve, and he essentially puts the whole earth in front of them. And he says, I want you to go, and I want you to do what I did with creation with the rest of the world. You get the idea as it goes microscopic in Genesis 2, after the big macro view of Genesis 1, that God left much of the world uncultivated, as it were. So he actually cultivates Eden. He makes this sort of oasis in the midst of the world that's perfect and pristine, and he puts Adam and Eve in that garden. And you get the idea that the rest of creation was meant to be cultivated by Adam and Eve in just the way God did with Eden. But the question is, that's looming before Adam and Eve is, how are you going to go about doing that? How are you going to finish the job? Just like I left the world formless and void, and then I filled it up and formed it and filled it up. Now I want you to be like me, and I want you to do that with the rest of creation. But the question is how are you going to go about doing that? And that's where day 7 and the 2 trees in the middle of the garden become all important. What's so significant about day 7? Well, the significance about day 7 is that God rested on that day. And the double significance about day 7 is, unlike all the previous days of 1 through 6, those days ended, and day 7 never pronounces an end. It never stopped. Day 7 is still going on, as it were. In other words, there is a rest. There is a rest that's available right now from day 7 through the end of creation. There is a rest for all those who are looking for it. This is why Jesus will come and he say, "Hey, come to me, all you who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy, my burden, it's light." In other words, there is a partnership that exists in creation with God for all those who are interested. But if you want to go and do it yourself, you can do that. God's not going to stop you. You can carry life on your own. You can run your own course. You can go your own way, but you will end up weary and heavy laden. And God will be waiting for you when you're at full exhaustion. See, that's the significance of day 7. It doesn't end, but the options are seen in the trees. You got the tree of life, and you got the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And those trees are so important. Because what those trees are there for is it's there for the tree of knowledge of good and evil. You've heard me say this a million times if I've said it once. It was there to show Adam and Eve, look, you know who defines good. You know that. Genesis 1 is filled with 7 times God saw that it was good. You know that God takes the formless stuff and he makes it good. You know who gets good. You know who understands good. You know who knows best how to define what's good. You know that in your guts. Adam, you know it better than anybody. But here's this tree. And this tree is giving you an option for how you're going to cultivate what's uncultivated in the rest of the planet right now. Are you going to cultivate it in partnership with God, in His rest? Or are you going to choose yourself how to do it, and you're going to decide what's good and what's evil, and you're going to make those decisions for yourself? How are you going to do it? Because here's this tree, and if you take from the fruit and eat from this tree, that means that you're going to decide for yourself what's best to do with this planet and with your wife and with your kids and the whole shebang, or you're going to avoid the tree. And that will mean that you're going to occupy and fill and form and cultivate this earth in partnership with me. And you'll let me be the king over how these things work. But here's the great news, Adam. If you do that, if you partner with me, if you don't eat from the tree, it will be restful as you do. It will go easy. The ground will yield itself to you. It will be an easy thing. You'll still be doing the work, but it's going to be working with you. It won't be opposed to you. It's a wonderful thing. See, one of the great things that God did in Genesis is His greatest acts are all done while people are asleep. It's one of the neatest features in Genesis. Adam gets his beautiful wife while he's passed out, asleep. Abraham gets a promise and covenant with God while he's passed out asleep. That covenant is renewed to his descendant Jacob while Jacob's asleep. He gets it in a dream. And this is a picture that, look, when you're working with God, it's work, but it's not hard work. You still wear a yoke. Jesus said, I'm offering you my yoke. In other words, you're still my servant. You're working. But it's easy because my burden's light. Why is his burden light? Because he's got a strong arm. Amen? And so if Adam chooses to avoid doing what he thinks is best, maybe, and trusts, it leans not on his own understanding, but trusts in God and his wisdom, it will be work, but it will be restful labor. It'll be restful work. So this is the option that God gives Adam and Eve. And as long as they avoid the tree, they get access to the tree of life. Why? Why does it work that way? Well, here's why it works this way. Why did God create Adam and Eve? He created them to be in his image. In his image. And what is image about? Well, the readers or hearers of Genesis back in the day, they would know what image was about. And the reason why is because they would have seen kings conquer civilizations that those kings couldn't physically be present in. And as a result of that, those kings would cast an image of themselves, and they would take that image and they'd put it in those foreign lands so that everybody that walked by say, you know, Sennacherib, he's kind of the boss around here, or Darius, or whoever, he's the boss around here, Nebuchadnezzar, all these things, and we need to worship them. That's the idea. And what God does is he says, look, I want the whole world to know who created this world, who runs this world, who's running this world for its good. And so I'm going to create people in my image. You can't create a statue in my image because I've already created my image. It's humanity. And humanity, as long as it avoids the tree, as long as humanity trusts God's good versus its own, they will go on reflecting God's character and nature. And as long as they do that, God says you can have access to the tree. Because access to the tree of life would mean access to life. You would live on and on and on and on and on and on and on. In other words, he says, look, I want that image to be perpetuated because it's in my image. But of course, you know the sad and tragic story that Adam and Eve ate from the tree. And the moment they did that, they didn't lose being created in the image of God. But what they did mar was that image. And so I shared downstairs, I shared with you before, it's like John Calvin says, it's like an image of yourself in a carnival mirror. It's still you, but it doesn't quite look like you. You got a big head and little feet, and it's all jacked up. And that's kind of what the image of God is in humanity. You turn on the news, you do not see a good picture of God. You see a warped picture of abuse and war and bloodshed and hatred and violence, racism. This is the sort of thing we see. Political corruption. This is not a picture of God. This is a distorted image of who He is. But this is what happened. And do you know why it happened? Well, the author of Genesis gives a very subtle clue. In Genesis chapter 3, when the serpent is talking to Eve, we see the same words that we saw in Genesis 1 over and over and over again. We see these words. The woman saw that the tree was good. And you find that now man is the one seeing instead of God. And now man is the one determining what is good and what isn't good instead of God. And so when they eat from the tree, what's fascinating is that what would have been restful in their labor in cultivating and conquering the earth is now not restful. It's not ease. What happens? Well, the woman is affected in her primary sphere. What does she have? All the mammals have ease in child labor, in their offspring. When they give birth, it's not an excruciatingly painful process, but it is with a woman now. It's not ease anymore. And a man, when he works the ground, it doesn't yield to him. He has to work it by the sweat of his brow. And so you get the picture, man, what would the ground have been like without the curse? It would have been a beautiful thing to work with. It would have been ease. And then you see that the image that is now dwarfed, messed up, distorted, that image needs to die. And so just like we pictured with the statue of Saddam Hussein being torn down by the American troops, so humanity now needs to fall down because it's erected itself as a false competitor idol with God, and they need to die. And so they die. And so then what the author of Genesis does is he says, look, okay, man is now calling the shots. Man is saying what's good and what's not good. So I'm going to devote chapters 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and 11 to show you just a glimpse after glimpse after glimpse of what humanity looks like when man is on the throne, when man calls the shots. So that's what it does. Genesis 3 through 11 shows you the destruction, the devastation when man says, I'm going to do it my way. What's the first casualty? Well, the first casualty is human relationships. As soon as they eat from the fruit, Adam and Eve that were depicted as being naked and unashamed, all of a sudden they're afraid of each other. So human relationships are distorted. They're broken. They're ripped. I shared with the men downstairs that a name for Satan that we call the devil comes from the Greek word diablos, which is two Greek words, dia, which means through, and balo, which means to throw. And so the word means to throw through. And so you picture a baseball thrown through a window or a bowling ball thrown through pins in an alley, and it disrupts what's there. And so Satan comes in and he just disrupts good things. And so the first thing that he disrupts is human relationships. They're not innocent anymore. There's not an ounce of trust between Adam and Eve. They blame each other. The second thing that goes, which is essentially the first that went, was disruption in man's relationship with God. God comes to walk through the garden. You get the idea that this is like the dad from work coming home. Adam and Eve very likely would have went out to him, but they hide now. We see what Adam and Eve's good looks like in their children and their offspring, where Cain slays in cold blood, premeditatively, his younger brother Abel. And then we see what Cain's descendants look like, what his fruit looks like. And we see that most poignantly in Lamech, his descendant, who breaks God's order and takes two wives instead of one, and he boasts about how vengeful he is. He's even more vengeful than God. And you get this idea that you go back to the garden, you say, what did God want Adam to do? Well, one of the things he wanted him to do, besides guard God's goodness in the garden, is he wanted him to plant and cultivate. And for any of you that have gardens, you see how your gardens yield more than you yourself can eat a lot of times. Just yesterday, I came home and my neighbor Ralph left me a bag of tomatoes on my back porch. This is what happens. And this is the idea that we as humans, we're supposed to multiply. We're supposed to fill just like plants do. And they multiply and multiply and multiply more than we can even feed ourselves. And so you get this idea of life flourishing. But then when you look at Adam and Eve's good and you look at their descendants, all you see is death, bloodshed, minimalizing. It's awful. It's the exact opposite of the flourishing that was meant to take place. We see in Genesis 5, according to Adam and Eve's good, and he died, and he died, and he died, and he died, and he died. So we see that when man decides what's good and what's evil, death is the result. That's the idea. And then you see an account where humanity attempts to get back in the garden in some weird relationship with the angels, the sons of God. And we see that out of that, it was a selfish thing because the result of whatever happened there was violence and bloodshed to such an extent that only every thought of people were evil all the time. This is what happens when you and I choose sin. Death just comes. Evil just comes. And so God takes the flood as an action to preserve whatever goodness was in humanity. And the only place you can look to whatever goodness is left in humanity is in the man of Noah. It says that he's blameless, he's righteous. He's the best we've got, as it were. But then after the flood, you're left with the best humanity's got. And after his sacrifice, which is a good action, the very next action of Noah is planting a vineyard just like Adam, getting drunk and lying naked in his tent. So you've got, again, nakedness, gardens, and shame all over the place again. And God's saying, look, I've blotted out everything that was evil all the time, and I've kept one remnant, one vestige of humanity, and look at the result. This is what sin does. We see his son Ham come in the tent, do a disgraceful thing, and invite his brothers in. This is just another picture of the Cain of Adam and Eve, the Ham of Noah. And then we see Babel itself, where now humanity's trying not to be violent. They're not killing each other like they were before with the sons of God and the daughters of men. They're not doing that. This time they're together and they're saying, look, let's not be violent. The flood came as a result of violence, so let's have peace. But in our peace, let's erect a tower that makes a name for ourselves. So again, it's like they're in the garden competing with God. And they're saying, we will win. We will compete. Our good will outlast yours. It's like Eden all over again. Man choosing his good over God's and competing with him. I'm going to take a moment here and summarize even a more truncated version of what I just told you through a video, and I'll ask the guys to go ahead and get it ready. It's by a couple guys that have come together, and it's entitled The Bible Project. They have several videos that are extremely helpful, and I want you just to picture visually what I've just said to you on the screen. And then after, I'm going to come and give a short closing before the musicians come. But I encourage you to watch and learn. This is the Bible Project. time that we have left, I want to look through Genesis 1 through 11, and I just want to point out where God's grace is throughout man's disruption of his creation. First, right after Adam and Eve sin, God promises to crush the serpent's head through this wounded victor that the Bible Project points out. Second, God shows that he's still passionate about what's good in that he says Adam and Eve must die. I don't want you to miss the goodness of God in doing that. See, listen, there is only one image that we should worship and enjoy, and that is God. That's him. He's the only one that brings good. He's the only one that will bring joy to your life. You can't find it anywhere else. It does.